Good day, everyone. This is Alan Schimmel, CEO, Media Ops for DevOps.com, Security Boulevard, Container Journal. Thanks for joining us on another webinar roundtable today. We have I think it's going to be a good one. I hope you'll enjoy it. Our live panel discussion today is open source risk management in the financial sector. So we're going to focus in on the financial sector. But if you're not in the financial sector, there's still something here for you, because we're going to have a really good discussion about open source risk management, and I think you'll find it very interesting. I have an amazing panel of folks. Before we do that, I want to thank WhiteSource for sponsoring today's live panel discussion, so many thanks to them. Let me quickly introduce you to our panel. I'm going to introduce each of the panel members. They can tell you their company, a little bit of their background, etc. So I think we're going to start off with my friend Reese Arkins. Reese, welcome. If you don't mind, introduce yourself.
Thanks very much, Alan. It's nice to be here. My name is Reese Arkins from WhiteSource. I'm the Director of Product Management, and my main responsibilities are developer solutions and supply chain security.
Excellent. Thank you. Thanks, Reese. Next up, we have Dan. And if I mispronounce people's names, I apologize beforehand. Okay. But Dan Menicucci from Microsoft. Dan?
Thanks, Alan. So Dan Menicucci, I work for Microsoft. I'm a Chief Security Advisor out of our Corporate Security Solutions area. But I focus on working with financial services customers, helping with security strategy and architecture conversations. Nice to meet everyone.
Nice to have you here, Dan. Welcome. Next up is another friend of mine, James Macleod. James,
hi.
How are you? Introduce yourself. Go ahead.
I'm very well. It's good to be on the panel with you again, Alan. So I'm James Macleod, Director of Community at FINOS. We're the FinTech Open Source Foundation, and we're a community creating open source solutions for financial services.
Excellent. Welcome and thanks for being here. Then last but certainly not least, we have Murali Kanadinya, and I did my best. Murali, I apologize if I messed it up, but introduce yourself.
Thank you, Alan. Really happy to be here. So I'm Murali Kanadinya from Wells Fargo. I head enterprise platform architecture within the Chief Technology Office in Wells Fargo, with a focus around CI/CD, cloud, SRE functions across the bank, active member within the FINOS consortium. Very excited to be in this panel discussion.
Thank you. So we call this a live panel discussion because it is, right? We're not going to have a bunch of slides here for you. This isn't slideware. You can go on the net, and there's no lack of slideshows on open source or financial stuff that you can look up. This really is a discussion. It's an interactive discussion with you, our audience. We're using something called Big Marker, which is the platform we're using. It should be playing in your web browser. There's no downloads or anything like that. It's really great for interactive events like this. What I like about it is, for most of you, you're going to have this big white kind of communications panel that you see, and it's marked with chat, Q&A, polls, and handouts. We're just going to be focused on two areas of that today. One is the chat, and if you click on their chat, you'll see you have public, private, Twitter. We don't really use the Twitter one. It's outside of our environment. But you have the ability here to chat publicly. I see some people already are. They're asking if the meeting will be recorded. Yes, all of these are recorded and available on demand. But you know what? Use the chat. Let people know you're here. Let them know where you're here from. We always like to see where in the world our attendees are coming from. So how about a hello from wherever you are, and you can put it in there. You can ask questions in chat. However, those can be answered by anyone. If you want to ask questions that'll be answered by our panel members, I'm going to invite you over to the next part of the communications panel, which is labeled Q&A. And in Q&A, you'll see that we actually already have a few questions that we had gotten earlier on. But you can put questions in there for the panel, and I'll do my best to get them out to the panel to discuss. So panel questions in Q&A, general observations, chat, communication. Under the chat public option, you could put that in there. I I see people already. We've got Canada, Toronto, Belgium, Boulder, Colorado. Let's hear it for Boulder. Boulder, and Lisbon, Connecticut. We've got a bunch of people from California. Well, thank you all for wherever you have been joining in from. I see we have friends out from India. I hope we pray for India's. You guys are going through a hard time now with COVID, and I'm glad you're able to join us. That being said, though, let's jump in to today's event. And I see we got rid of the slide, so we'll get right to it. Look, this live panel is about open source risk management in the financial sector. So let's start there with maybe a baseline. What do we, when we look at the current state of open source vulnerability management, right, and specifically in the financial sector, because one of the interesting things about, I've been in security 25 years. There's always three verticals we look at, right? There's healthcare, there's finance, healthcare, government. Those are three of your top verticals. Financial sector can be a world unto itself, as I'm sure James will tell us. But what is the current state of open source vulnerability management in the financial sector? Reese, this is something, this is a white source kind of sweet spot. So I'm going to ask you to kick us off, and then the rest of our audience to jump in.
Yeah, thanks, Alan. So in the first point, I guess, is to talk about open source adoption. So finance is no different from any other industry or vertical. You can't build websites without open source, and it's very hard to build pretty much anything without it. So it's a very high adoption of open source in finance is the first part. The second part then is the adoption of open source and vulnerability management. In this area, as a ballpark figure, you might think around half of companies in general have some form of solution, half do not. Finance, we see that being much higher. There is a great awareness. Finance companies are all tech companies, one way or another these days. They build tech. They have chief security officers or people with similar responsibilities. And there's really no one who could do that job and ignore vulnerability management today. So that's why we see that is a very high adoption. There's just no way that someone in a position of authority in those companies would ignore it.
I don't disagree at all. Thoughts from the team?
Yeah, definitely. So this is James from FINOS, and it's great to be with everybody here today on the call. And I totally agree with Reese. I mean, if you rewind maybe 5 or 6 years ago, open source wasn't as well known in financial services as it is today. Certainly not within UK retail banking, where I kind of cut my teeth. But as engineers and engineering leads actually found their way into the C-suite of many banks, the whole organization actually became aware that open source was something that was being consumed into banking systems. And rather than, shy away from it, banks have, adopted open source. They've realized that it exists, and open source security, especially when it actually comes to, how engineering teams consume and also contribute in the context of digital transformation as well, has been something that needs to be accelerated. So rather than kind of put blockers in front of every single release, using automation and automated tools, no matter where you sit within your software engineering life cycles, has always been something that DevOps leads, software engineering leads have been wanting to solve, and they are solving. Yeah, and so Murali, I know that you're with Wells Fargo. It'll be good to hear your point of view on how Wells Fargo are also consuming and contributing or being involved in
Yeah, James, like the panel observed, we develop a very large portfolio of software, north of about 4,000 applications that are kind of morphing into products, and they source their dependencies internally as well as from the outside. And there is an incredible amount of change in the course of we going agile, and we are actually rapidly reconstructing the software portfolio, keeping in mind what the customer journey and the customer experiences are. What we have done for quite a while is institute a very formal program around application security practices. There are 11 security practices that we have instituted and raising the awareness of developers to understand why this is really important to pay attention. So we built the machinery to not just really be, defensive, but also be enabling, because developers are really very familiar with how they've really done stuff in their prior lives. We are attracting a lot of talent, and they bring in their favorite open source libraries along with them. And we really want to be very thoughtful in accommodating their needs. And we really want to have a very pragmatic ways, in terms of really sourcing those dependencies, but doing that without compromising the security and stability of the software. So we obsess a lot around speed, security, safety, and stability, right? So we kind of optimize on how do we cater to developer productivity, but also be very vigilant on the security dimensions of that.
And I'll sort of jump into, I think that I concur with what everybody on the panel said, and I applaud what Raleigh and his team are doing. The reality is there's a tremendous amount of value in open source, and everybody is looking for ways to include that work into the projects that they maintain, including Microsoft. And the reality is, there's an important aspect of it, managing the risk and managing vulnerability management as part of all that, because at the end of the day, your customers don't care whose fault it was, whether it was code that you've written or if it was code that you've included from somewhere else. It's your responsibility if something goes wrong. And at the same time, the attackers don't care what code they're attacking, whether it's stuff that you've written or if it's something that you borrowed from an open source library. So I see it as very top of mind for the customers that I work with. And I think there's lots of ways and awareness around what people should be looking at and think about as they include this to protect themselves and protect the customers that are, giving them their trust.
So let me jump in here. I remember a time when financial institutions wouldn't touch open source software, right? Or at least publicly acknowledge it, right? It might have been snuck in the back door by the developers or even the security people, frankly. But they didn't, their official policy was not to use open source software. Obviously, that's changed, right? Open source software is used, I forget what the number is, 98% of the global 2000 or something like that. It is clearly part of the mix, as Dan mentions. But also, as Dan says, your customers don't care whether they lost money or had an incident because it was an open source module or something you guys developed in-house, right? They just know something happened to them. And so I wonder, and Reese, I'll throw it at you because you're at WhiteSource and you got to deal with this. Are we creating an artificial environment where we need to check the current state of open source vulnerabilities versus the current state of all of our vulnerabilities?
Yeah, so Dan put it quite well before when he talked about this idea that if you ship it, it's your responsibility. That's been one of the major hurdles in companies having an intelligent adoption of open source, because people tend to think when someone else has written something, they tend to associate it subconsciously that that's someone else's problem. I didn't write it, it's not my problem. People are becoming much more aware now that if you ship it, if you use it, it at least is your responsibility, even if you don't want to think about it as your problem. But yes, there does need to be a combination of more holistic awareness, both of open source as well as, we'll call it closed source components. We've seen some very public supply chain security problems, even just this year, 2021, being publicized, and they're not all open source. I mean, in fact, many of them are not what you would call kind of open source. So companies do need to have a more broad view of risk of any third-party component.
Agreed.
So, Alan, do you mind if I come in?
Yeah, no, you don't have to ask permission. Go ahead.
All right, so that's my British instinct to kind of ask permission on things. So the other thing to recognize is the way that engineering is actually changing in banking. So, previously, and I don't want to refer to the past too much, you would have, big consultancies actually running banking systems for the banks, and so you'll have support contracts and, maintenance contracts being negotiated, and the banks wouldn't actually they would know about their systems, but they wouldn't actually, be under the hood. They'll have, various different support contracts that are written for maintenance and to make sure that, there was consistent uptime. But now, banking teams, as it was explained, at the beginning of the webinar, they're now technology companies, with engineers actually in the banks themselves, maybe not in the retail bank branches, but certainly, back office. And when I say back office, I mean many thousands of engineers, all engineering the systems now. And so by having open source, as part of your software engineering kind of like, arsenal, you can consume systems where those engineers can actually see under the hood. You can also have support contracts that are supporting open source systems that mean that you don't have to, kind of be locked into, vendors and, have that vendor lock-in that engineers, like to have control over. And also when it comes to open source, and consuming that, there are so many dependencies within open source now that you need to have automated mechanisms to be able to check that, because you can't have, single panels or single working groups of solutions architects kind of ticking the box on everything that you're consuming. And so now banking has changed from being that, let's give it to that big consultancy over there to let's bring it in-house and let's really control this and, have real skin in the game when it comes to engineering.
I would say, James, complimenting everything what you said is the proactiveness. So, if you really look at the risk associated with open source, there is an aspect of licensing and the awareness that folks really need to have, as well as the vulnerabilities that are associated with the software. So by early awareness and making the developers be aware of what the trends are, we could really help them make informed choices on what it is that they're really going to source. But that's just step one. Once they've really identified their intent on what they plan to use, we have been investing in creating very pragmatic tools that would allow us to scan and make sure that they're devoid of vulnerabilities throughout the life cycle. Gone are the days when you took about 3 months to release a software. There are businesses that release 730 times a year, so there is an incredible frenzy of change that results in a deployment into production, and therefore you have to be proactively scanning and also identify a community to say, when you do find vulnerabilities or issues with the software, what exactly is the mitigation strategy? Because oftentimes when you find something that is concerning, you really don't have a clear resolution as to what is the workaround. And sometimes it can actually take months, weeks, in terms of finding an alternative. So getting the community to identify what might really be an acceptable alternative is really important, because business doesn't really stop just because you had a vulnerability.
Don't disagree. Reese?
I was going to say, finance is quite well known, even outside of finance, as being an industry that has a lot of, we'll call it like legacy systems. Like even COBOL running and things like that. There's an idea that, and it's not in the bad way, that if it ain't broke, don't fix it. They're more like it works, and it's still working. The challenge is that you can have maybe corporate systems that are decades old that run and are still in use. But if you have open source, which is even getting to like a year plus old, the chances that you have known publicly disclosed vulnerabilities is very high. So I think there's a little bit of a mind shift change where, like James talked about, third parties delivering a software, fully functional, working, complete, and doesn't get touched maybe by the end customer. You can't do that when there are open source components, because it's just too easy for people with bad intentions to attempt to find people who haven't upgraded their dependencies. So,
Reese, just to add to your COBOL observation, remember a lot of these systems are actually built on top of Linux, which is an open source kernel. So right at the heart of a lot of the systems that are running, it's an open source kernel. So there's no escaping. So there is no legacy in a lot of the mainframes that are being run.
No, I mean, look, so I think it's a given that most of the major financial players are mainframe shops, but that doesn't mean all of their applications and so forth run mainframe, but there is a mainframe back end, and mainframe can run open source, Linux, etc. They're always ran containers, even before containers were cool, right? But it brings up a question that came up in the Q&A from Mirza, which is how do you track new vulnerabilities in old open source components? So this is the classic Equifax situation where they were using an old version of the Struts 2 component, right? So Murali, you unfortunately, I got to go to you because you actually work at a financial institution. How do you guys track old components there?
So, Alan, we take a very pragmatic view, right? We actually rely on extracting the metadata of every software that we have, whether an application is internet facing or it is dealing with payments or it's got a high dollar value. These are characteristics that tell you, what is the intent of that application, and you have a risk calibration of like what that application is trying to do. So based on that, we actually key off and say, you got to implement a whole slew of controls or tools that really help you manage that metadata-based approach to really say what security controls do you really need to implement. So regardless of whether you are, building a new version of your old software or starting something completely new, you are really subject to implementing all of those controls and presenting evidences, through those 11 practices that I mentioned previously. And we really have security champions scrutinizing the evidences that you're really presenting to say if they are really acceptable. So we are on the side of caution, obviously. We're a highly regulated institution. So what we try to do is bring the security champions to sit down with the developer to say, hey, let's look at the findings of your security static analysis tool and really figure out what exactly is that really doing, and raise the awareness of the developer to really write more defensive code, and then go through the machinery of like rebuilding, write more defensive code, and then releasing it. So we don't rely on what was delivered or released a year ago. We are continuously vigilant and scanning all the time.
I agree. I'm sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, sorry, Alan. I was going to build on, how do you actually know, where all of these dependencies lie within the taxonomy of a bank? So within FINOS, we actually have an open source project called Vaults, which was contributed into the foundation by Deutsche Bank. And what that is, that's a system. So you can go onto the FINOS GitHub organization and take a look at this, anybody, who has access to that. And it's a crowdsourcing platform for solutions architects and also engineering teams to chart out their own independent architectures, but it's done in a way that's crowdsourced across the bank. So you can see what the interrelated dependencies are within systems. And this was actually seen. So I don't know if it's a mitigation to the problem that you actually raised, but it certainly mitigates, kind of where one system relies on another, where you're in a big enterprise and you might not be able to see everything that you're related to. It's a little bit like the butterfly in Brazil flapping its wings and there's a tsunami in Japan, that metaphor. But yeah, so the open source in banking ecosystem realized that there was a problem there. They wanted to solve it. Deutsche Bank contributed Vaults, and now banks can actually start charting out the taxonomy of their internal interrelated projects, to mitigate any vulnerabilities that might come through.
So James, we have actually taken that approach, and we loved the phrase "architecture on the wire." It really gets our architects jazzed up. So we've kind of implemented that system to kind of trace the pathway, of the call graph, so you can kind of navigate, what call resulted in, you touching which system. And this is the metadata approach that I was alluding to before. You now have the means to visualize, exactly what that ecosystem of dependencies are, and then you can double click and figure out what are the ingredients that makes up that particular system. So now you really have been, the ability to be very hawkish about, what systems are and what impact, an incident from the outside might really have, so you can quickly remediate our internal systems.
Something else I'd add on the topic of kind of scanning and open source, and James and I have worked on something similar with FINOS, and that is that to do it well, especially with older systems, is that you need to decouple the concepts of scanning from vulnerability detection. Because a question that we've got sometimes, people say, well, if you're only going to check for vulnerabilities every time we scan, what happens when we stop committing to this project? Because or even if we're committing daily and there's a vulnerability discovered and publicized at 10 p.m. my time, and we don't make a commit until 8 a.m. the next day when work starts, I don't want to wait that 10 hours to be alerted that there's a critical vulnerability. And the answer to that is that for open source, you do need to decouple the concept of scanning from detection, meaning that your scanning is for knowing a current state of what you're using, but the number of vulnerabilities you have can change. So something that had no vulnerabilities, at 7 p.m. can have a critical vulnerability at 8 p.m. and you didn't change any code. That's because someone discovered and disclosed it. So that's a key thing with legacy systems or older systems, is to make sure that the process that you use is not coupling detection to scanning, because older projects won't get scanned very often, and you don't want to rely on only alerting at the same kind of cadence that you do committing.
And I think it's important that the point to sort of underline all of this is it's important to have that asset inventory, right? And build that asset inventory through automated process, because you can't protect what you can't see, right? So, once you have that database or whatever of, here are the packages that are in use, here are the dependencies to those packages, here are the versions, then you can sort of layer on those detective pieces and the vulnerability management capabilities to say, hey, here's a CVE for this, or here's something that we've detected through some of our own in-depth analysis of this package, or here's new versions that were released of this, and we're 12 versions behind, and these newer versions address different products. And so I would say, one of the things that I find most important is making sure that organizations have that visibility into the open source components that are in use throughout their projects. And again, not just at time of scan, but hopefully for all the systems that are in use, whether they're legacy or your most current projects.
So I agree, Dan. I think one of the challenges we see here is, as we are raising our posture with regards to improving test coverage and improving software engineering practices, the pragmatism that you want to exercise is do all of the diligence on new code. But then you also really need to, do all of that on our existing code, and using constructs like policies, mandating a forceful rebuild of your software, even there's nothing changing, is actually a very healthy thing to do. So we set that expectation with our application teams to have them, sweep through their entire code base and rebuild, even if there is no feature change in the particular product.
So I'd like. We're not gonna. We're halfway through. We only got one question, but on that topic, though, again, we've got from the audience Q&A. This concept, and I think Dan, it's what you were talking about. You just didn't say the actual term. The software bill of materials, right? The SBOM, right? So, the recent supply chain attack that we saw. Without naming names, I'm not here to blame anyone, but with these kinds of attacks, it's important that we have a software bill of materials, so we know what's actually in this software, what are the components in there, what versions of it, etc. And it's so important that the recent executive order that came out of the White House, which will remain to be seen how enforceable it is, but is asking that. It says that the software bill of materials must have that in there, right? It's now a requirement, if you will. So I guess my question then, no question, it's clearly a statement. Does that kind of codify, Dan, what you're talking about? I mean, how much more important can it get? The president gave an executive order on it. Clearly, the time has come where software bills of material have to be part of our normal operating procedure, standard operating procedure, if you will.
Yeah, I think they are important. I was glad to see that it was part of the executive order. It's oftentimes companies are trying to assess their risk, and if they don't understand, how that package came together and what the various components are, how can they manage the risk of it, other than saying, we have blind faith and blind trust in whoever. And so that software bill of materials is going to provide the ability to audit against all of that and do some of your own due diligence, right?
So, Alan, luckily you're speaking to people within financial services who are used to working with regulators. And so, literally every step within the SDLC needs to be audited, and evidence needs to be provided to regulators in order for software to be published. And so, getting, so I'm in the UK, so I kind of, live outside of executive orders by administrations. But that's okay. We're very much used to, providing evidence for, software engineering, no matter where it lies. So whether it's open source related materials, whether it's, providing documented evidence on, how you procured a system, within financial services, we've got audit trails, audit logs, and we're probably even more aligned to adapt to any form of, government or, presidential ask.
Yeah. I mean, look, we spoke a little bit before we came live. We live in such an interconnected world. If an organization like a Wells Fargo is going to adopt a software, bill of order as standard operating procedure, it's going to apply to Wells Fargo across the board, right, across the globe. So I don't, but I think the bigger issue is, does this make software, I'm sorry, I forgot the term of art there for a second. Does this make these SBOMs, right, software bill of materials, does it make them the standard way we do things? Should every organization be doing this now?
Yeah, Alan, I think from the way we see this, we call it software composition analysis, which is before the team begins to even start composing the software, we seek to understand their intent of what dependencies they have and what transitive dependencies that might lead to, right? So we kind of need to resolve that graph of transitive dependencies to understand if we really did the build, here are the bill of materials, that you would end up having. And then we subject all of the dependencies, through a scanning process. So before they even come within, our premises, we really scan them to really identify, two things: license issues as well as vulnerabilities. So, before we allow them to do any kind of a build, we really do that scanning. But then that doesn't stop with that. Well, there is another dimension, which is, if you heard of things called segregation of duties, depending on who's really touching the software and who are all the people who are pressing the buttons to push the production, it really takes another dimension of its own. So we really need to have the complete, details of who touched what, when, what was the evidence approved, whether it is static analysis or dynamic analysis or software composition analysis. So when you're really coming and saying, hey, I'm ready to deploy something into production, you have to present the full body of evidence, and then someone really needs to take a very careful look and then go. And you got to do this balancing productivity and not really be very draconian saying no all the time, because we have a business to run. So that's basically how we implement it.
Definitely, and automated scanning can actually really help in that area when it comes to auditing your software. I remember working in the team where we did an automated scan of software that we adopted, and we found trial licenses within that software. If we hadn't had automated scanning, that could have slipped through the net and potentially made it into a production system. And so having automated vulnerability and malware scanning that also includes license scanning can actually stop a lot of not necessarily untrusted software, but certainly licenses that you wouldn't want to get through development and into production slipping through the net.
I would say I would like to put in a plug. I think with the FINOS and the Eclipse community, there are some really good tools that help you manage that. So I would highly encourage the audience to go take a look at these tools that really help you manage both the various licenses as well as managing all of the metadata that you would really want to keep track of.
Thank you, Murali.
All right.
Alan, we did want to cover that a little bit, on the idea of shifting left in the developer lifecycle as well. So
excellent
James mentioned,
segue, Reese.
Yeah,
I gotta
so,
jump in, guys. I mean, we could talk about this all day, obviously, but I got other topics. So on the topic of shifting left, and this whole notion of DevSecOps and making security everyone's responsibility, let's talk a little bit about best practices for incorporating security and compliance check earlier in the developer workflow, right? So we do call that kind of shifting left. But beyond the buzzword of shift left, what we're really talking about is running our security test earlier, right?
compliance.
And compliance, right? Security and compliance, they're linked, but running them earlier, right? When I started a company doing vulnerability management 20-something years ago, the notion of testing for security vulnerabilities pre-release, I would say 10% of organizations did it, if most. Even as 3, 4, 5 years ago, 75% of organizations were testing pre-release for security, but that meant that 25% weren't, which is ridiculous, right? I'm sure it's much higher now. I think most, overwhelming majority do test pre-release. But what are the best practices that have, grown up around this? And I'll throw it out to the team. Who wants to go first?
I wanted to say off what James mentioned, because he gave an example of, a piece of software that was adopted and was scanned and had problems. And, that's great that it was caught, right? But it would have been much better if the developer, whoever had built it, hadn't spent hours, weeks, months building something with an invalid license or a non-acceptable license. So that's really what's meant by shift left is something, instead of catching it late and having to redo everything, it's like try and preempt it if you can. And so that means developers, for example, having the ability to be alerted immediately if they're about to select a component that has a license that they're not allowed to use, or is hasn't been updated for 2 years, and you have a policy against using unmaintained software or things like that. That's really the crux of shift left, because that saves you all that time that developer would have spent using a library that they had to throw away.
Absolutely. I'd actually say if you're scanning everything pre-release, you're probably scanning it a little too late.
Yep, I agree.
The way that we set up our teams was to actually have security vulnerability scanning as part of each story that you're developing against your agile workflow. And so the definition of done, if we get into agile terms, was that you had done those vulnerability scannings at the point of development rather than at the point of, going down your software delivery lifecycle, or your route to live. And so I would say shifting left is, as you're grooming your stories or grooming your features or kind of grooming your backlog, all of those security vulnerability scans are part of the checkboxes that you need to go through in order for your Scrum Master or in order for your product owner to accept the delivery of that feature. So it's like really tight up against the team at the point of build, rather than all the way down to the right at the point of release.
I think one of the things we've seen is that in the old school, if you had sourced your dependency through your transitive resolver, you could have really had this into your code base, and there has been bad practices of putting that into your source code repository. Now, the risk of that is, unless you really go for a big build, you won't really find out, what exactly those vulnerabilities are. So through a combination of education and awareness, we are very prescriptive and opinionated to not really take in the open source libraries and put it into the repository, and really keep the 12-factor principle of like separating dependencies from your source code. So that's very healthy. Then what you can do is when you do these builds, you really have tools that really do all the scanning based on the awareness of CVE. So they can really, raise your awareness as to what you really need to do to look for alternate versions, etc.
Exactly. I mean, at the moment, we're talking about vulnerability scanning, on the desktop or kind of on your IDE, but then you've also got vulnerability scanning or malware scanning at the point of consumption through firewalls as well, which is the consumption of open source. So Reese, I mean, maybe you can answer the question of, how does, WhiteSource or similar tools actually mitigate, security vulnerabilities on the engineering desktop, and then, on the firewall as you bring stuff in, that maybe the software engineers or even, your infra teams don't have visibility of?
Yeah, it's a great question. Thanks, James. So it's a good time also to mention that there is like a very important subcategory of vulnerabilities. It's often kind of mixed up, and that is the malicious package. The malicious package is probably closer to the idea of viruses or worms than it is to a traditional open source vulnerability. Like a traditional open source vulnerability is essentially a mistake or an oversight that somebody made writing code by accident. Whereas what we're seeing is an increase in malicious attacks where there is an attempt to kind of backdoor open source packages or trick people into installing a package which was backdoored from the start. And in that case, even scanning on the desktop, as James is talking about, is kind of too late. I mean, that would be like a virus scanner saying, hey, that attachment you clicked on, that was a bad idea. So like if you only have the capability to scan after you've downloaded and installed and got it on your system, it's too late. So in that case, we're finding that we need to shift things even further left. I call it the ultimate shift left, but there might be a step before that we think of in future. But that is to block the download of packages which are suspicious or completely unknown, and that needs to go right the way to the package manager. Either the package manager itself or plug into the package manager. You don't want that getting on your computer. Most likely firewalls can't be aware enough. Like these are not things like a DLL that can be spotted, a malicious DLL. These will be like part of the code, part of the Ruby, part of the JavaScript that sets up to allow remote control and things like that. A firewall has no chance of knowing that that's a bad thing. So it has to be an awareness in the language itself of the packages itself.
Let me introduce something though, and it comes from a Q&A from the audience, which is, we talk about the challenges around open source financial sector. We're talking about scanning for vulnerabilities. Another important part, it used to be a lot more important, and granted, I think it's probably less important today, is open source licensing compliance. And I'm wondering, Reese, and forgive me, I don't even know if WhiteSource checks for licensing compliance, if that's like in your area. But, Morale, I'll throw it out at you, James, in your experience, how are we, when and where are we checking for open source license compliance?
Yeah, I'll share, our perspective. We used to have dedicated staff that were curating all of the libraries, but quickly we realized that that was, simply not sustainable at the pace at which you are sourcing dependencies, etc. So our, automated CI/CD tools do really have the capability to kind of do on-the-fly scanning, and you really resolve your dependencies to check both for license compatibilities as well as the vulnerabilities. Very, very encouraged by what I'm really seeing with these dependency managers. So we feel that with that, we can really have a fighting chance to keep up with all of the nuances of the licenses, because if you really look, there are like, unbelievable number of nuances with the licensing language. So, we have to kind of curate that and not just rely on what the scanning manager tells us, but then have our experts take a look at it to make sure that we're really not putting the bank at risk. So that's the aggressive posture that we have taken to dealing with licenses.
Fair.
Yeah, and also just to back up what Morali was saying, so funnily enough, within the foundation, we actually operate in open source. So our open source contributors are making builds on GitHub.com, whereas you also have banks developing on the inside with their feature teams inside the banking firewalls. So certainly when people are making contributions into GitHub.com, you would have a product like WhiteSource doing vulnerability scanning, and then maybe a product like Fossa doing all of your different checks and all of the different licensing that you're consuming. And when you consider, so I come from a JavaScript background, and so a lot of the dependencies that you actually consume into your JavaScript or Node or React or Angular front end are interrelated through npm. Everything that you're actually bringing down will have a license attached to it. And so if you've got deeply nested dependencies, you need an automated check that's going to actually traverse that tree and pick out where actually you're not consuming something which is Apache 2, but it might be something that requires you to get in contact with the original team or the maintainers of that team, and you want that flagged at the point in which you actually make that first build. And so, license scanning is important, and there are ways to traverse that, as I'm sure there are through, other package managers, that consume from open source and elsewhere.
Fair. A sister issue to me with licensing for open source is, how do you quantify the total cost of ownership of open source in your organization, right? Too many people out there say, open source is free. Yeah, there's free is in freedom and free is in beer, right? I'm wondering is there a tool for that? Is it put your thumb up in the wind to see which way it's blowing? Again, this is a question that came from audience as well. Anyone?
Yeah, I've got an answer for that. So I wouldn't quantify it in terms of cost of ownership. I would actually say, if you think about computer science and software engineering as a finite pool of people and resource globally, and the amount of problems that you need to solve, as society, within software engineering or computer science, open source is a way that you can actually join all of those people together in a way that allows me to find people and maybe attract people to my projects. Whereas if everybody worked for an organization against contracts, now people obviously do have contracts, but open source opens up the world so you can get like diversity of thinking into your projects, rather than having to go to a recruiter and kind of like recruit somebody from a small pool of people within your local region. It just kind of opens the world up. And then the software being free, that is kind of true. I mean, it can be free, but you can also engage with companies who actually build businesses around open source. So you can go to consultancies like Red Hat, for instance, who will actually have their products which are open source, but then they will also help you with support agreements around that. And so it's not necessarily that open source is completely free. You may want to support it yourself, and it allows you to do that. But actually, I see it as kind of having access to a community of thinkers, globally, who can help each other out and do really innovative and interesting things.
I would say, from our enterprise perspective, here is how this is pivoted, right? If you really look at our vast portfolio of software, we are continuously reconstructing that software, keeping customer experience in front and center. So our own internal portfolios are kind of really acting like a supply chain. So if you are in a line of business, chances are your dependencies are actually being sourced from another line of business. So that's what they're really seeing. So every application developer or a product developer have actually tackled the problem of sourcing the dependencies from the internet, really dealing with all the open source inertia. But then they have actually curated what is an internal asset. Now that problem is actually shifted within Now we're actually seeing the inner source dimension where you really need to kind of curate all of the internally developed, software, whether it is microservices or libraries or utilities or what have you, right? They're actually being, the suppliers for our business-facing applications. So that's how this problem is matured within the enterprise.
Yeah, and if you look at, what DevOps is actually there to achieve, it's to increase quality, increase acceleration, increase efficiencies of engineering, and reduce costs. A lot of that is done through duplication of effort, and certainly within financial services, there was once a walled garden of engineers, within banks. There's loads of duplication of effort. And so open source allows, those engineering teams to come together, develop it once, reuse it everywhere, and then move on to the next problem to solve. And so, yeah, for me, open source is kind of like the next evolutionary step in finance to DevOps.
Fair enough. I don't disagree. I think, so here's and I've written articles about this, James. Can you have DevOps without open source? Right? And I mean, theoretically, yes, you can. But the way, in real life, the way things have evolved, they're so intrinsically linked. Right? The idea to be able to, and even just the way we develop software today. Could we develop rapid application development the way we have without having, libraries of open source components that allow us not to have to reinvent the wheel every time or pay a royalty for every little widget that goes into our software, into our apps. So, but that's probably for another panel. You know what, guys, we're coming up here at it's 9 minutes before the hour. We have enough questions to do another one of these, so we may have to invite everyone back, and we'll continue doing it. But before we get too far, I needed to announce our Amazon winners: Ricardo B, Robin S, Adam D, and David W. Congratulations! Our team will reach out to you and make arrangements for you to get your Amazon gift cards. Thank you so much for participating. Guys, we have a few more. We could go into big topics, or we could use the rest of our time to try to nail down some of these questions.
I think there's some good Q&A there, Alan, that we can.
Yeah, there is. And I didn't want to leave it. So one question, which I think is kind of something we touched on earlier from David in the audience, which is, do you set your vulnerability remediation times in a similar nature to what you've done for non-open source software, whether you want to call it closed source or commercial? In other words, I've got to get a remediation or a patch out here within 5 days if it's a critical vulnerability. Or are you dependent on the community that just when they release a patch, they release a patch? Dan, I don't know if that, Microsoft, well, Patch Tuesdays were legendary, but.
Yeah, I mean, I think when it comes to all vulnerabilities, right, it's how exploitable is the vulnerability from the vendor's perspective or from whoever reported it. But then the other part is the business context to it, right? Is this something that is an internet-facing application that this vulnerability could result in, remote code exploitation or vulnerability? What's the business value of the asset that code is running on? Is this something that's critical to the business and there's going to be loss of revenue or loss of, reputation loss as a result of that? Obviously, those are things that you have to respond to very quickly. And I think it's all part of the vulnerability management process to take all of those factors into consideration that are going to drive your response times. And if there's a vulnerability and there's no patch for it, then the organization is left with how to mitigate that vulnerability. Are you going to go into the code and try to fix that open source library that introduced that vulnerability, or are you going to do something else to mitigate it in the environment? So I think, I think it's sort of looking at vulnerability management the same way we do for everything else, and it's these multiple factors that you have to take into consideration.
Absolutely. Sorry, Reese.
Go ahead, James.
I was going to say, within FINOS teams, we actually operate in the open in much the same way as a feature team would do inside a bank. So if vulnerabilities are actually found by the open source community, you can raise an issue, and then that will get triaged by the team. It will be prioritized on the backlog, and then it will be fixed by a team of engineers who you have access to. And so we actually encourage people to come forward with the vulnerabilities that they find. And this is where the many eyes in open source makes software a lot more robust. And you can then follow that issue all the way through to, production and release. That's what I wanted to say anyway. Sorry, Reese, back over to you.
Oh, thanks, Jason. I was going to say that there's really kind of three categories. You've got open source as one example of vulnerability. Closed source can kind of be split, because closed source can be, could be Microsoft products, for example, as a supplier. But it also can be the code that you write yourself as well. So often companies get a vulnerability report that might say, hey, you're a game server, and I discover that if I manipulate the URL, I can exploit a race condition and log in as another user or something like that, right? So that's the type where you can assess someone's reported it, but hopefully no one's exploiting it, and you might set like 5-day, like the Q&A said. But when it comes to publicized vulnerabilities, it's a lot different, whether it is a closed sourced component or an open source. Like, if the people who are likely to exploit you know about it, it's a big difference compared to, well, hopefully nobody bad knows about this yet. So there are cases, both closed and open source, where it's not, the question said it like 5 days to remediate a critical. I mean, there's times where it's like -5 minutes, like you just have to get it out right away. It's as Dan said, the exploitability. It's about, is the service got person identifying information in it? It's also about discoverability as well. So the Apache Struts one that was mentioned is a particular one, because a lot of web servers literally tell you what they are, like who they are and what version they are. So if you're running an outdated web server, it's going to like literally just tell you. It's very easy to discover. If you've got some cryptographic library that's got a vulnerability, and someone would have to figure out, first of all, that you're even using it in the first place, let alone how to get manipulated data into it, it's very different. So you really, you can only ever set like a ceiling on the response time, and you need to be adaptive to the risk.
Fair. Anybody else, or we have other questions here? So another question came in. We mentioned this new executive order that came down, I guess it was last week or maybe the week before. Any other concerns or thoughts about how this executive order might have an influence on open source software security in the financial sector? Reese, any?
Yeah, I'll go again. I was just pausing, but I've seen some interesting takes on it. People talk a lot about how open source is underfunded. You mentioned OpenSSL before. There's a big thing. Everyone uses OpenSSL, and it's like unfunded. Guess what? It's actually still not funded. It's literally something like $5,000 a year in donations for OpenSSL.
Yep.
I saw an interesting take last week. Someone said, well, the biggest benefactors of open source are kind of startups. Startups always use open source. Maybe the VCs should be funding open source. Maybe the VCs should have a pool of money to get like stable, tested, secure open source. Today, I saw somebody saying, as if they sort of had an insider view, that this executive order may see a rain of money down on open source. So maybe it's actually the US government will be the savior of, securing open source and funding open source.
Sure, my tax dollars at work, great. But but you're right. I mean, many. So in my time, I've seen, us enter into what I call the foundational era of open source. And if you're an Isaac Asimov fan, that has, a particularly nice ring to it. But I mean, that frankly is one of the nice things about like CNCF or Linux Foundation, right? Sponsoring some of these, or not just sponsoring, they manage these open source, right? They're responsible for the monetization and make sure that there's some good rules, there's some process being followed, there's some, prior to that, we were in what I call the big brother era of open source, where a Microsoft or an IBM or Hewlett Packard, HP would in essence own an open source project, they supported it, but that was only a small percentage of the thousands of open source projects out there, many of which are very important, like OpenSSL. and are existing on $5,000 in cash a year. It's, I would look to the foundations who manage a lot of these open source.
Yeah.
And I think that's, someone like Morali at Wells Fargo, he could feel better about using an open source component or project because it is managed by the Linux Foundation or one of these.
So just to add that Wells Fargo are a member of FINOS, and FINOS are part of the Linux Foundation. And so
yep. I mean, because it's not a one vendor deal, right? Everyone can be involved in it. And I think, you know what, we're at the top of the hour. I think that's a great place to end this. Guys, as I said, we have enough material for two more of these. So we'll talk to our friends at WhiteSource to see if we can't run it back and try to scratch the surface into the rest of it. I guess we just had a shy panel and you guys just wouldn't talk enough to finish it up. But Dan, Morali, James, Reese, thank you so much for joining. For all of you out there, and we saw from all over the world, thank you for joining in with us. Thanks to our friends at WhiteSource for hosting or for sponsoring this today. This is Alan Schimmel for MediaOps, Security Boulevard, DevOps.com. Thanks, everyone. Have a great day, and we'll see you at our next roundtable webinar. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Alan. Thanks, everyone.
bye-bye.